My name's Paul Schaeflein. I'm a longtime developer, coder guy, flew in from Chicago, thanks to Steve, so I'm happy to be here again. Here's my contact information here. I can give you a card with the same info if you can't spell the name correctly, but I'm happy to take questions as you get back to the office and start using some of this information. If you have a question, I'm happy to work on any questions. Just be sure to say, I saw you at Evolutions about AD and give a little context switch. Responses might be slow because Build is next week and Ignite's the week after that, so it's kind of a crazy time for us, but I'm happy to answer questions if you have anything on that. The next thing I want to point out is that this talk has come straight from some work we did for Microsoft at what they call the Virtual Academy. So Microsoft Virtual Academy is a website that Microsoft puts out, and a bunch of us created some training content that includes videos and slide decks and code samples. And provide all this information about Office 365. So if you haven't seen Microsoft Virtual Academy yet, I strongly encourage you to go there. I'll show you how to get there when we get into the demo with some of the websites. It's basically off dev.office.com. So the slides are going to look very familiar because, again, I talked to Jeremy. He's on board with this. Make sure we're talking. We want to get this message out about how to do that. And so the point here is we're going to cover how do our applications and our users authenticate to Azure Active Directory and how we do that in our code to make sure that we play nice within the authorization framework. So, having said that, how many in the room have done Office 365 Dev? Excellent, excellent. And I presume many of you have also done provider-hosted apps or apps for SharePoint? Okay. So I'm not going to go in depth on that. If you're confused about those two, Chris O'Brien's in the Henry Moore room doing a comparison of the two, so I won't be offended if you want to go see his talk. What we're going to cover is how the authentication happens behind the scenes with Azure AD when you're doing development against these two different platforms, if you will. So the goal is to converge it so that you don't write apps for SharePoint, you just write these apps in the Consume Office 365 API and it just works. That's the goal, but clearly we're not there yet. And you'll see there is some rough edges as we go through some of the 365 stuff. So we'll cover a little bit about what Azure Active Directory is, why it exists, and we'll talk about how we authenticate users in this environment. And then we'll talk about OAuth. OAuth is the protocol that we use to authenticate applications, not users, okay? And then we'll cover the couple different development scenarios. Now, if I want to clarify a few things here right now, right? So when we're doing user authentication flow, we're typically doing what we call federated identity or SAML tokens that go back and forth. This is all about authenticating the user. OAuth is used to authenticate an app. OAuth is very popular with Twitter and Facebook and so on, right? And everyone thinks I'm going to log in with my Facebook account using OAuth, which is kind of a misnomer, right? What OAuth is used to authenticate an application, not a user. However, there's a new standard out called OpenID Connect. Sadly, we're not covering it today. There's just not enough time. But OpenID Connect is the ability to authenticate the user using the protocol for OAuth. So it's we're kind of merging that environment here. But again, we're not there yet. So that's why we'll cover the Azure AD user auth separate because it's still a little bit different there. So that's what we'll be covering today. Azure Active Directory is Microsoft's cloud-hosted access management solution. All right. To get Azure Active Directory, when you create an Office 365 tenant, you get a directory. And there is a screen in the Office 365 admin that does users and groups and so on. So you can manage the users and groups of your Active Directory from an Office 365 interface. You can also connect that Active Directory in Azure using an Azure. You can log into the Azure portal if you'd like and see that Active Directory, or you can link that directory to another subscription that you might have in Azure. But at the end of the day, we have this Active Directory, and it has users, it has groups, it has attributes. It's been extended for Office 365 to include applications. So the key takeaway there is that an application becomes what we call a security principal. So when I have something that logs into a service, I could log in users. I also log in apps, and that's what we're going to be covering today, is how does the app log in and establish its identity with the service so that whatever secured resource we have knows who's knocking on the door and can decide whether to let them in. Make sense? So again, you get one through Azure. So most common scenario is you get an Office 365 tenant, you get a directory, you set up the directory sync, which is now called Azure AD Connect, and it replicates user accounts from on-prem into the cloud, and then people can do all their work. That's your typical scenario. That's exactly what we're talking about here, is that we're going to have this directory that's used for Office 365 authentication and application authorization. But in addition, Azure AD covers all kinds of other things as well. There's a couple hundred applications, software as a service applications that can use Azure AD as its login, such as Salesforce and Box and a whole slew of other ones. And you can put your apps in there as well. So our end users log in once to see the home page, and then when they run your app, they're still logged in, everything just works, everyone's happy, right? That's our goal, is to make this seamless as possible. And so the next concept, we have this thing called organizational accounts, which I should probably change. They are now called work or school accounts, right? So we don't have it on the slide here at all, but back in the day, we had Hotmail accounts, right, or Outlook.com accounts. Now those are called Microsoft accounts. So when you log into Office 365, you need to put in a user ID, which is in the form of an email. And based on the domain that's after the @ sign, the service will figure out, is this a domain like Hotmail.com is a Microsoft account? If it's abc.com, maybe it's a work account or an organizational account. So we're always going to be using organizational accounts when we're working with the Office 365 and the Azure Active Directory information. All right? And that's what we use to access all these resources. And what we're showing you here is, right, here's our Azure AD, and we have our on-premises information here, and this is that Azure AD Connect, right? And so the whole point here is that at the center of everything is Azure Active Directory. This is our app down here, and we're using an organization account, also known as a work or school account. Now, there are some scenarios where you can grant access to someone who has a Hotmail or an Outlook.com account, and they would log in with a Microsoft account. But typically, as you're building an application and integrating it with your Office 365 tenancy, you'll be using organizational accounts. Okay? That kind of helps simplify that matter. Here are the steps to link up. As I said, remember, there is a Azure Active Directory, there's a directory in Azure backing your tenant. And if you want to link that up into Azure, these are the steps you can do that. It's somewhat cumbersome, and you have to be an administrator in both things, if you will, right? And so this kind of makes sense, and I had to go through this myself. I have an Azure subscription that I pay for, and I'm a global administrator. I have an Office 365 subscription that I pay for, I'm an administrator. So I would go into Office 365, log in as global admin, click on the Azure link, and it says to Azure, it says, oh, who are you? And I say, well, I belong to this other Azure subscription. It says log into that subscription, because now I have to prove that I have rights to both of them. And once that's done, I can now see my Office 365 directory in my Azure subscription, right? That's really just a convenience for the user in the user interface. Under the covers, there's a directory. And you can create multiple directories in Azure, which I get a little out of scope for what we're talking here. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening is I want to go into the I want to make sure if I'm in the Azure portal that I have access to that directory, and then I can go in and say I want to add an application, because we'll do that as part of the tooling or in the interface. Okay, any question? A little background there. Does that make sense? Any questions before I get too far in the weeds? Okay, excellent. So as I said, organizational account is what we're doing. That's how users authenticate to the service. Okay? You can add them manually, or you can use synchronization. I'm not going to go into detail. Spencer did a talk on Azure AD Connect, or the synchronization. And Kirk Evans is from the Azure Center of Excellence, so we've been messing with Kirk all week saying, if you have any Azure questions, Kirk's the guy to ask. The poor guy's being inundated. But Kirk did a talk as well, first thing on Monday morning on the Azure Active Directory as well. So he went into so much more detail from the directory perspective than what I'm doing here. I'm focusing more on the app level. So you'll get the recordings, and you'll want to do that later. So now, enough of the words. Let's illustrate the user authentication story, right? So there's three things involved, right? So we have a user, we have a secured resource, and we have an authentication source. These are the generic terms that we have here, right? So this is actually a security principle. So there's somebody or something who wants to access a resource that's been secured, and we want to understand what's going on here. So these are our three parties involved in this conversation. And when the user comes into SharePoint, and I'm certain you can't read what that says, I can barely read it myself, but a user is trying to access a SharePoint resource. And in the browser, right, by default, every request in the browser starts as anonymous. And SharePoint's going to say, well, I don't allow anonymous. Go away and come back with the token or with the authentication. So it's redirected to a site called login.microsoftonline.com. That's a browser redirect. The browser redirect takes you to Azure Active Directory's login screen. You log in with an organizational account. Azure Active Directory then returns another browser redirect, but it also has, it's a it's a script that has a token, if you will, right, like a key. It's a token, it's issued, it's called a SAML token. That's a security assertion markup language. It's basically an XML string that has a bunch of claims, and the claims are typically things like what my email address is, what my first name is, my last name is, and it includes a cryptographic signature. That SAML token then is, using JavaScript, is posted to SharePoint. The token is presented, and SharePoint will then use that token to determine who the user is. Does the user have authorization to the site or the list or the item that I'm trying to access? Right? And so what's saying here is we're returning, assuming this is, well, there's a slide here we didn't show here. Under the covers, these two servers have been pre-connected to understand what's going on here, right? And that makes sense. SharePoint has configured SharePoint in the cloud, how to connect with Azure Active Directory in the cloud, and make sure that that cryptographic signature is still valid and it trusts the certificate in use. What this is saying here is that as we come back and the home page shows up, right, we're having that waiting for it that goes on. Once that's done, what's returned is what's called a FedAuth cookie, F-E-D-A-U-T-H. That stands for Federated Authentication. And that's an industry standard in the browser world where it says, here's a cookie that I want you to store issued by SharePoint Online. So when I navigate throughout SharePoint, the browser will send the cookie. SharePoint will validate the cookie. As long as the cookie is valid, it doesn't prompt for another login. And that's how we get multiple pages in the same session, right? This is exactly how it works on-prem, SharePoint on-prem, except instead of Azure AD, it's your domain controller, or it's integrated NTLM, or it's Kerberos, but same concepts, right? Nothing too dramatic there. Yeah, subsequent requests, it did that. Okay, so that's user authentication. Any question? I think it's pretty straightforward. It's really not new. It's been around for a long, long, long time, right? IIS 5 or something like that. But we have this new thing called OAuth. OAuth is an acronym for OpenAuth, and it is a simple mechanism that's basically allowing a third party, which is your application, to access something on the user's behalf without sharing a password. It's a good thing, right? We don't want passwords just floating around all over, right? Again, it's an internet standard supported by all the big players. And so think about this again, right? If you were going to log in with Facebook to somewhere, you go somewhere and you say, I want to log in with Facebook or log in with Twitter. What ends up happening is you get typically an iframe and you actually get the login screen for Facebook and it says, do you want to allow this app to access your friends? Right? And you click yes, typically, right? Remember now, where that login actually happens is not in this application. The login happens at Facebook. And you tell Facebook it's okay that this app works on my behalf. And that's what we're doing here. Again, the password is not given to the app. The password is provided by the authentication server, and it allows the app to do work. So before we had 3 actors. Now we have 4, right? We have a client, which is an application. That's whatever you're writing that wants to access some resource on behalf of a user. Right? The resource owner is basically the user, right? So your choice is I can put password in plain text in my code, or I can encrypt it, or I talked about Credential Manager last night, or we can use OAuth, right? So there's the resource owner. The resource server, this is basically SharePoint. That is the server that has the resource. And then lastly, we have an authorization server or authentication server, depending on how you want to look at it. But in this scenario, it's authorization server saying, hey, I know who the user is, and here's a token that proves that the user is who they say they are, and you can act with the token. Right? So here's some examples of what that would be, right? We can write a SharePoint app. We can write an Azure web application. We can do anything, any kind of app, if you will. Again, we have an organizational account. Right? And in our scenario, the resource server is typically SharePoint or Exchange. Doesn't have to be. You can write a server, a service, if you will, that uses Azure AD as its authorization source, and you can provide a resource server, if you will. And then this is a little bit of a misnomer. Azure Access Control Services is how provider-hosted apps work. That's not how Office 365 apps will work. And I think over time you'll see that Azure ACS is used much less. So if we remember back here at the beginning, I had the little picture of the person down here, right? A security principal. Starting in SharePoint 2013, we have an application that can be a principal as well. So if users, remember, if you grant permissions to something in SharePoint, it was always an AD user, an AD group, or a SharePoint group, right? Those were our 3 security principles. We have a new one now called the application principal. And you can grant access to something to the application. How does the application prove its identity? Well, it uses what the fancy words they call a client ID and a client secret. That's a username and password. So when you see client secret somewhere, and Visual Studio does a great job of putting it in web.config for us, please don't leave it there. It's a password. Client ID and client secret is how the app principal is going to authenticate to the authentication service to say, this is who I am, I have to prove who I am. If you're running on-prem and you set up server-to-server trust, you use a certificate. That's a little bit more secure than a password, right? But we can't do that in the cloud. We can't configure a server-to-server trust with the Office 365 service. So we have to use a client ID and client secret. So we want to make sure that we secure these resources, and there's a couple different choices on that. So clearly we don't want to have, okay, so we have a client ID and a client secret, and the client says, hey, this is who I am, I want to do something. But remember, the whole point of this is for me to access resources on behalf of a user, and I don't have the user's password. What ends up happening is we have this tokens that get passed back and forth. And so when I connect to SharePoint, SharePoint first is going to redirect me and say, here's a context token. And a context token is just a base 64 encoded string. It's a JSON object, if you will, that basically represents the context of the request. And it's saying, hey, I'm SharePoint, and an app named, Paul's app is trying to access something, and it says, take this context and go to the authorization server. And then the authorization server says, oh, I know who SharePoint is, let me do some work for you. And assuming everything is valid, the authorization server gives you an access token. A token allows access to the secured resource. So if you have an access token, you can access the resource, right? If you have the access token, you can access the resource. So when you get an access token from the server, your application should probably treat that securely. If you have the token, you get access. It doesn't say how you got the token. And we like to say it's kind of like cash, right? You pick up cash off the floor, you can spend it. If you get an access token, you can use it. So protect your tokens. Don't let, and then the samples we're showing here, there's a token cache that will, the samples have a simple value, but you might want to make that a little bit more production ready, if you will. So an access token has typically got a short lifespan. And I'm drawing a blank now. You know how like when you, typically a web session lasts 20 minutes and you might have to re-authenticate after 20 minutes? Well, an access token has a lifespan, and I want to say it's about an hour. It might be a little less. I can't remember. Vittorio has a post on that. I'll get that link for you if you want. But eventually the access token is going to expire, right? Which makes sense. We don't want these things laying around forever. So in addition to an access token, you get a refresh token. And so an access token you present to SharePoint and says, I want to access a list, here's my token. The refresh token, you can go back to the authorization server, the Azure or Active Directory, and say, hey, here's a refresh token, give me a new access token. Okay? So I don't have to log in a second time. I can refresh my access using this refresh token. And refresh tokens have a longer lifespan than access tokens. Right. And again, there's some defaults in Azure AD, but the point, if you look at the spec, that's really at the determination of the authorization server. Right? And the authorization server reserves the right to revoke the abilities of the refresh token. So for example, if I get an access token, or I get a refresh token today, or right now, and then in 10 minutes I go change my password, and then in 20 minutes I send the refresh token back, Azure AD is not going to let that refresh token, it's going to expire that refresh token because my password changed, right? So you can see there's all that's built into the service. And the other kind of token we get is what we call an authorization code, which means on the fly I can request access. And we see that typically you'll see that at the very beginning of a user's use of an app. We'll talk about that. So this is what I was showing you before. Very important. If you store the token in a JSON object and I open up the browser tools, I can get it. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I just want to ask you this question. This context token, what was that?
So we have a diagram that shows that, but when initially you go to SharePoint first, right, to get something. SharePoint will say, I don't know who you are, go get a token. And it provides what the context of what resource you're trying to access and what server you're on and who the user says that they are. That's what that context is token. It provides context of the request to the authorization server. All right, we talked about this, right? If an access token is compromised, right, that means someone can use it until it expires, all right? And again, so what we're saying here is there are some limits to the damage that can be caused if these tokens get left or hacked, right? They have an expiration built into them. Oh, and I forgot to mention, when I have a refresh token and I want to go get another access token, I need to present my client ID and client secret again, right? So, but there's still a little protection there. So even though they are what we call, bearer tokens, they could be, if they get hacked, they could cause damage. It's a little bit limited based on time and password. Okay, how are we doing here? It's done 20 minutes, all right. So that's like an overview of a bunch of these, and I seem to, okay, so we're going to talk about two different scenarios that we hope to converge in the future. Provider-hosted app, what we've been doing, and then the new Office 365-based app, right? So in provider-hosted apps, again, we have an app principal that's built into SharePoint. You register those with SharePoint Online. This is the old school or older school stuff that we would do, and we would create that. We can use the app reg new page to register a new a new app principal. I give it an ID, I give it a secret, and I give it a permission string. Sound familiar, right? If you don't want to use the web interface, Visual Studio also will let you register an app principal, right, and do that. And the whole process of publishing it to the app catalog or to the Microsoft Store will also generate these app principals for you. But in general, I'm identifying the application with an ID and a password, or what we call a secret. Okay? Provider-hosted apps in SharePoint, the registration happens in SharePoint. Here's how it looks. You can generate, the ID is a GUID, the secret is a base64 encoded hash of some kind. I can't remember how they do that. I give it a title and I give basic information here. I'm not going to dwell on that. We'll just keep moving through. So now how does this work? We register an app principal. What's the flow? So first of all, we make sure we have an organizational account. We make sure the app is registered. The app gets deployed, typically in the app catalog, right? It could be in the Microsoft Store, but somehow the app is deployed. Provider-hosted apps have a remote web. We're assuming that's been deployed as well. And then we want to make sure that the client ID and secret are defined in Azure Active Directory. When I go to app reg new and register it, my SharePoint takes care of registering it in Azure AD for me. And here's how this flow works. So this is they call it an Azure website, but this is the app that you wrote, the website that you've written. We have our end user, we have SharePoint Online, we have Azure, right? So this looks familiar. We had 3 before, now we have 4. User goes to SharePoint. SharePoint says, I don't know who you are, right? And it's going to what we call request the context token, right? I'm sorry, yeah, so it's going to request the context token. The token comes back and that gets sent to the browser, right? And so this context token, the user has come in here. I didn't show you user authentication yet, but you can imagine that happened, right? We saw that flow before. So the user's authenticated here and the app wants to do something. You click on the site contents icon for the app, right? I get this context token from Azure Active Directory that says it was SharePoint Online, it's this tenant ID, it's this site, whatever the URL could be, and that gets sent back to the browser, and then that is posted to my app. And the entry point of my app, the app start page, gets a post that has kind of parameters, right? So you've probably seen this before. There's a host URL, the app web URL. But in the body of the request is the actual context token. Okay? The context token is then passed to Azure Active Directory. This is your app. It sends a client ID and a client secret along with that context token to the authorization server, which is Azure AD. Azure AD will look at that context token. Who issued the context token? Do you remember? Azure AD. So it will validate and make sure that nobody in the middle here has tried to monkey with this context. Assuming that's valid and the user ID, or the client ID, client secret match, then it will return an access token to the app. The access token lets the app access the secured resource. Once, obviously content then comes back to the web, the app, and that we get all that, right? So that's the flow now when we have an app involved, right? I get a context token issued by Azure AD, and I use that context token to get an access token, which then I can use to access the resource. When that access token is returned, it also includes a refresh token. Okay? So at some point in your app, you may make a request to SharePoint with an access token, and you'll get a 403. So immediately your app can take the refresh token and say, give me another access token, and then try again, right? Of course, the refresh token may have expired or may have been invalidated, so your app should be smart and say, hey, you know what, if I continually get an issue here, then I might need to show us the user interface to say, hey, you have to go get another SharePoint context token, right? Provider-hosted apps, that typically doesn't happen because you have the web interface. Users are always clicking on it. But what if you wrote an app as just using, console app using CSOM? You might need to write some logic into your code to surface a message of some kind. Okay, so now we can get into some code finally. To help you manage all this stuff your app needs to do, Microsoft provides a SharePoint ACS context class in conjunction with Token Helper. So if you've written a SharePoint provider-hosted app in a current version of Visual Studio, you've got this. If you're using older Visual Studio 12 or you haven't updated Visual Studio 2013 in a while, you haven't seen this yet. But in general, this class will then help abstract away all that management, all the back and forth that has to happen with Azure AD. And it provides these methods that I can call in the various things that actually explicitly state what I'm looking for and what context I want, right? So do I want to have app-only access or user access? And do I want to access the host or the app web, right? Same thing for REST, all right? You guys okay with the app-only, app web, host web, I hope, right? You all raised your hand. You have a question?
Yeah, I'm just confused about the Azure AD is actually replacing ACS right now, or is this a transitional thing?
It is a transition, right? So the question is, the Azure AD is replacing ACS, right? ACS is a protocol on top of Azure AD that's used by provider-hosted apps, okay? They are de-emphasizing it because, if you think about it, Office 365 is a superset of SharePoint Online, right? So rather than write a SharePoint provider-hosted app, why not write an Office 365 app? Because next month, when you have to add capabilities to your app, you don't have to rewrite it, right? So it's...
In terms of if you've already got provider-hosted apps, then you maybe fiddle around with the context and the security.
Yeah, so no one has said to me it's going away. They're de-emphasizing it. It's still there. It still works, okay? They're not gonna just pull the plug. I mean, because they know there's stuff out there, right? So you're okay for now. But again, there's no user interface in Azure to ACS service. They've kind of done away with that. But if you've done it through SharePoint, the AppReg New, or Visual Studio, you're fine. Until, I mean, in the future they may deprecate it, but they haven't yet. So here's a sample of a web form. Wow, I didn't know Microsoft still did samples in web form. That's basically using this call here. You can see here I create a context by passing in the HTTP request. And this class, this context provider here, this is the code provided to you by Visual Studio, does all the work that's necessary. And you can see here I'm just passing in a HTTP header. The header name is Authorization, and the value is bearer space then the token. And here's a little helper method to say, hey, I want a token that represents access to the host web on behalf of the user and the app. So it becomes very simple for you to do that, right? And so the example they're doing here is actually an HTTP web response. Oh, this is, yeah, on a REST call, I have to actually create the the web request. So it's really quite simple. All that work, all that the diagram, the back and forth is handled for you automatically by that SharePoint ACS context class. It handles all that for you. If I'm doing CSOM, it's very similar. Again, I create the context, and then when I create my client context, instead of just getting a token, I say, go ahead and create the client context for me. Again, SP host, again, include the user identity, and I can make my call. So that's pretty straightforward stuff there. Again, that's a page load. Let me go over to a demo, and we'll do MVC, and you can see how that works. So I have, not this one. I have an app already built here, but let me show you how I would do this from start, and then we'll go to the pre-built one here, just in the interest of time. But if I'm going to go through and create a new project, I'm running Visual Studio 2013 Update 4, right? It's the most recent version of Visual Studio, 2013 anyways. And Office SharePoint, expand that and choose an app. App for SharePoint, click OK. Again, I need to have, this hasn't changed, right? So I still need to have a site that has the developer template, and I can choose. So it's already set up. I'm choosing a provider hosted app, and we'll choose MVC, right? And so to your point about ACS, right? We're going to use Windows Azure Access Control. This is really Azure AD. The other choice is only available if I'm on-prem. That says that on there, SharePoint on-prem. I need to then, Visual Studio is going to do that client registration for me. I don't have to do app-reg new and generate an ID and a secret. Visual Studio will do that for me, and that's what's going on here. So I have to log into my account. Pardon me while I use the itty-bitty keyboard. There we go. So I think most of you have said you've done the apps. I think this might be a review. So just bear with me here while we let this go through. I want to cover it for anybody new. What SharePoint is now doing, again, I said it's registering that app in SharePoint. It's going to then use a template that's provided, an MVC web template with some extra goodies added in. If I open up the Solution Explorer, all right. Again, I have my SharePoint project that has the app manifest and such in there. My web project, web.config is going to have values in here. You can see here's my client ID and client secret. Hey, the client ID is blank. What's going on here, right? Well, when I press F5, it'll fill that in for me. Automatically, it'll talk to the server and say, hey, what's the client ID, and populate that in web.config for me. So you can see it's all set up. In addition, I have these two files here. One's called Token Helper, one's called SharePoint Context. SharePoint Context, this is the class that we just saw in the slide deck, right? And it comes through and it lets me understand, get all this information. In MVC, however, that's implemented in a different fashion. We don't have a page load in MVC. So what I end up getting here is an authorization filter. And I can never find it. But I'm going to switch over to my home controller. Here it is, and press F12. And so you can see here there's an action filter attribute that on the onExecuting method, it will go through and do information to validate that information. Again, this is all source code provided to us to do all this work. I'm going to go into the check redirection status so you can see where it's going here. You can see here how it's looking at the values that are posted in. Eventually, it's going to look to see, did I get a token, right? So I want to make sure I get these tokens, and if I have them, I might need to do a redirect. If I don't have them, I might need to redirect. If I do have them, I can actually do this thing down here is calling into the Token Helper class, which will help facilitate that. So what is this doing? The whole point here, what we're checking here is I have a SharePoint and I have your remote web, right? What if a user goes directly to your remote web without going to SharePoint first? If you navigate directly to the web, I do a get on your app start page, it's missing a context token, right? Without a context token, you can't call to get an access token. So this filter is saying, hey, if I don't have a context token or any of these parameters are missing, then I'm going to redirect you to what I think the SharePoint page should be. if your app is written to support multiple site collections, it won't know where to redirect you. You probably get an error, right? So it's kind of protecting us from having people just trying to poke away at the website. So I'm going to switch back to my pre-built one, and I'll just start that. And so now when I do this, I'm in a different project here, so it's going to make sure, again, what's happening here, remember the client ID was blank? Well, when I press F5, it's going to make sure it understands what the client ID is and the client secret. So I'm going to have to log in again. And again, if you've been through this before, you'll see this. It's going who, make sure deployments happen, it runs. So I'm going to launch the browser. It'll go to my site. It'll say, okay, now that you're in the browser, you need to log in again. So let me click that. Notice I have the organizational account icon. That's working on it. During the working on it, SharePoint is talking to Azure ACS. Make sure it's happening. When that finally finishes, it comes back and it says, okay, I got your username, right? So all this app really does is connect up to SharePoint and say, give me the name of the current user. It seems kind of odd, right? The name of the current user came from SharePoint. How did SharePoint get it? From Azure AD, right? So that's provider-hosted app. Pretty straightforward. Nothing's really changed. All these new announcements and improvements in the Azure Active Directory Office 365 story, this hasn't changed, right? Yes, ma'am?
With the ADFS integration, the APIs, is that going to change?
With the ADFS integration, does the API change? The answer is no. When I first logged in, I had the Office 365 look, and I had to click on my name here. And when I type in my user ID and I tab to the password, if you're running ADFS integration, the browser would redirect to your ADFS server for you to enter the password and then come back to Azure. So SharePoint doesn't even know that that happens, doesn't care. SharePoint is just waiting for Azure AD to issue the token. In your scenario, if you're using ADFS, Azure won't issue the token until your ADFS validates the login and returns back to Azure. So you've got SharePoint, Azure AD, on-prem ADFS, then back to Azure, and then to SharePoint. Does that make sense? So API doesn't change. It's exactly the same. All right, let me shut this down here. All right. So provider-hosted apps haven't changed. Getting one started is pretty straightforward. Just use Visual Studio. Things get more complicated now when we're talking Office 365. And it's temporarily more complicated. It will get better as things mature. So how does this work? We still have the same thing here, right? So the user has an organizational account. The application has to be deployed. And I forgot to show you, in my provider-hosted app, in the app manifest, we have this permissions tab, and I need to request permissions. If my app is going to consume something in the host web, I need to request permissions. Sorry, I forgot to include this, right? So I need to, in provider-hosted app, I need to request permissions, and when I run the app, the user needs to grant those permissions. So let me just say I want to access the web. I'll do read, and let me run this again. Just to recap permissions, an app has full control on the app web. The remote web doesn't have any permissions. And then in the host web, I can only basically read well, actually, I was reading the username, right? So I have no permissions to the host web. I just told this now, hey, I want to be able to read information from the host web. And so now when I run this, I get the SharePoint trust dialog. And this is part of what changes. So as I'm reviewing here, it says, so SharePoint is telling us you have an app that wants to let access basic information about the site, read items in the site, and the information about the users, and I click OK. They call this the consent dialog, right? This is a SharePoint consent dialog. When I write the app, I need to explicitly request permissions, right? And then when I deploy it to SharePoint and it's sitting there, it waits until I actually run the app before it actually does anything about permissions. In the Office 365 space, things are a little bit different. Your application doesn't require a permission grant. It does make a request that says, at runtime, I do want to have certain permissions, but the scope is a little bit different. Because in a provider-hosted app, I'm installing that app into a specific site collection. So we know the scope of the request, right? If I'm running an Office 365 app, I can access SharePoint, that concept still applies, but I could also access mail or contacts or calendar. Whose mail? As a developer, you have no idea, right? So you can basically say in here, this app wants to access mail, but the actual scope of that request can't happen until runtime. And so that consent dialog looks a little different because it's not a SharePoint thing anymore, right? Does that make sense? So you'll see a little bit difference as we get into that. This is our same actors in here. We have our user navigate to the app. This is another difference. If I'm writing an app using the Office 365 API, the expectation is that I start in the app before we were starting in SharePoint. So I start in the app. The app says, I want to know who you are, I need to know something, so the app redirects you to Azure AD. Azure AD will then return to the user. It shows the consent dialog. You'll see that in a minute. If the user grants consent, then Azure AD returns what's called a code, authorization code, and the browser then presents that code to your app. With the code, your app can go to SharePoint and say, here's a code, I want to access some resource. If the code is valid and the app is valid, Azure Active Directory returns an access token, and then you can take the access token to SharePoint. It doesn't show it in here, but I could have a box here for Exchange Online, and if that code would let me access Exchange Online. But you see the difference? We're not starting in SharePoint. I'm starting wherever I am. And I'm going to then consume a resource on an app. So there's a big fundamental difference. I'm not extending SharePoint, I'm doing something. And it just so happens I need to consume a resource from Office 365. So that's a fundamental difference, and you need to make sure you understand that. So, because I'm starting in my app, right? So in the provider hosted, I was in SharePoint, and I clicked on a button, and I got a context token, and I got a host web URL, and an app web URL, right? When I'm in Office 365, I start in my app. What is the URL for the user's resource? You don't know, right? Well, the URL for mail and contacts and calendar is pretty well known because it's this Exchange, but which tenant in Exchange? Or in SharePoint, it's something.sharepoint.com, right? You don't know what the URL is as a developer. Well, you may know, but at runtime, you can, in theory, maybe not. So Office 365 has this thing called the discovery service, which has a well-known endpoint. And once you get that authorization code back from Azure AD, and now you know who the user is, you can call the discovery service, and it'll return a collection of URLs that are specific to the current user. Very helpful, right? I've asked and put on user voice and voted as many times. You know, Chicagoans are good at voting multiple times. I said, I want to be able to extend the discovery service. Let me put my line of business app in here, right? You can see there's some value there, so hopefully we'll get that soon. To consume the information, we use the concept of a client, and this client is basically, this is again sample code that Microsoft has given us, that we have a client that can read the Azure Active Directory graph. The AAD graph is how you manage users and groups and properties in Azure Active Directory. So if I want to add a user or check group membership, I use the Azure AD graph. SharePoint Online uses the AAD graph to manage users. Remember I said you can see my users in Office 365 even though they're stored in Azure? That's how they use that. Exchange Client does its things, and obviously the SharePoint Client does files. Sorry, the SharePoint Client file thing is really murky now because of OneDrive for Business. Let's hope that gets more clear as the next couple weeks. So here's an example of the Exchange Client. Right? So I start with a discovery, and you can see here what I'm saying I'm passing in I'm sorry, this example here, we're showing you how I've cached in session state, right? So I have a discovery context, you can see here, it's a class given to me by Visual Studio. I create the context, right? When I have the context, you can hear, I'm gonna say I wanna discover a resource, and I have a resource ID. And this is the well-known values, you'll see them in there, it's Exchange, it's SharePoint, it's Azure AD. That's gonna then return this discovery context object. And using that discovery concept object, which is, I love how they do this, they always messing around with me. DCR, where'd it go? Oh, you know what, I actually don't need this one. Here, discovery context, I want to acquire a token, and then I'm going to use, where's my, it's on the next page. I'm sorry. I get a discovery context, oh, I want to talk about the tokens. Again, this is code provided to you by Microsoft. I have this authentication context. You can see here I acquire a token by a refresh token. All right. If I don't have the refresh token, then I need to create a new one. What we're doing down here, this is the overload of the method. Down here at the bottom, you can see I have my client ID and client secret. I'm passing that to the service, and it says I really am looking for an access token. So I can either use the refresh token or the client ID, client secret, and give me back an access token. Using that access token, I can then consume the service. Yeah, let's go to code and show that. I don't like that slide. Let's go to the code here. Oh, so to get this code is kind of a convoluted step. Let me go here and go up to here. So, Visual Studio 2013 Update 4 doesn't know anything about the Office 365 API, right? Came out after the fact. So, you can run Visual Studio 2015 preview if you like that, or you can wait. In the interim, if you want to go right now and use Visual Studio 2013 to access the Office 365 API, we have to use a starter project. So where I'm at here, I'll scroll up to the top, is dev.office.com, and there is, under resources, there's this samples. Code samples is the first one here, it's blue. But code samples get you this page here. And then I'm going to do a 365 web. Where are you at? Come on. 365 dash web. I'm forgetting the name of it. There we go. So Office 365 Web API, ASP.NET MVC single tenant web application. There's also a multi-tenant web application as well. This is a sample of how to build an Office 365 MVC application using this information, this new protocol, the new service, okay? This link, this will take you off to a GitHub repository. Well, this will take you to more pages. So let me go here. I'm going to click here. That takes me to this right up here, and you can see it says see this in GitHub. I'm going to open this in a new tab, and on GitHub, you'll see over here, download a zip. Okay? If you're familiar with GitHub, you're welcome to fork the repo and work with it as you see fit. If you don't want to learn the GitHub or do any of that information, you can just download the zip. You get a zip of the application, okay? This is because Visual Studio 2013 doesn't have the tooling to support this new paradigm. Visual Studio 2015 will have that, all right? So this is a workaround we have to do for now. This application is here, my single tenant web application, and I'm going to actually extract this to a new folder, and that's fine, we'll put it there. So there's a step I need to do when I get in here. So let me go into this single tenant web app. Again, I have one done, ready to go, but I want to show you some of the steps. So I'm going to open this project, and I got 10 minutes, I think, right? Yeah. So an important step that I do here, remember before when we were doing the provider-hosted app, it prompted me to log into SharePoint, right? When I opened this, it didn't prompt me to log in anywhere, but I need to connect my application to the service. And so in Visual Studio 2013, and it's a similar experience in 2015, I right-click on the project. Oh, yeah, I didn't mean to do that. I right-click on the project, I choose Add, and I have to wait here for a minute. And there's an option here called connected service. And in the connected service, at the moment, the only connected service is Office 365 APIs. Visual Studio 2015, there are other ones in here. I expect we'll see that grow over time. Things like Dynamics Online, or not Dynamics, what's the CRM solution that Microsoft has, right? Dynamics, is that the right one? I expect you'll see that up in there in the future and so on. So I'm going to register my app in the Office 365 service, and now I need to log in. It says Visual Studio here, but I'm really logging into my Azure Active Directory tenant. Again, notice at the bottom, a work or school account is where what I need to use. It checks to see. If I was using ADFS, as your question was, I would be redirected to my on-prem login screen right now before. But since I'm not, I have this. I can log in. And so it's going to, behind the scenes, you'll see it's registering the app with Azure Active Directory. You know what it's doing? It's generating a client ID and a client secret. Okay? And now that that's done, I see all these services. So Office 365 is composed of these services. Look familiar? This particular app is designed to read contacts. So I'm going to choose contacts and permissions, and I'll say, go ahead and read. In addition, I want to choose users and groups and say, I want to enable sign-on and read user's profile. And I'm going to choose read directory data as well. This is important. Remember in our scenario, the first thing I navigate to the app. And the app talks to Azure Active Directory, right? And we said before, this is contacts. So whose contacts? The developer's contacts? The end user's contacts. Who is the end user? If you don't choose enable single sign-on, your app won't know who the user is. This will all fail. Right? So even though it should default to that, it doesn't. So we always want to turn that on. So I'm going to click Apply here, and click OK. And now my app is registered. I'm going to try to switch over to the Azure portal to show you what that looks like. I'm running out of time. Although I'll just press F5, it'll work. Right? Oh, you're killing me. You're killing me. I want to get through the app first, so we'll try to get back to that if we have time. This is the app that's provided. So this is my app that I did before, right? The single tenant one. After running the connected services wizard, I get this page open in the browser that tells you how to do this using Visual Studio 13. In addition, they give you a sample app here, and you'll notice it has, let me open it. The MVC app has a controller for account and contacts. The account controller does the login for you, and of course, I have all kinds of errors, which I'm not, there's some there's some NuGet packages that need to be downloaded when you compile this to do all this, but this MVC app is using the Open Web Interface for .NET for authentication. All that, on the picture, we went back and forth, remember all that? Taken care of for me using this account controller for me that Microsoft's given to us. And then I have a contact controller. Actually, you know what? I'm going to switch over to the one that's ready to run. That would be this one. If I look into the contacts controller here, again, Microsoft, this is where I see the discovery client context. Let me shrink this down a little bit. All right. And so, let me do this, format this a little bit better. Lots of this. So, at the top here, I'm pulling out the current user ID and their GUID from Azure Active Directory, because remember, we log in, we said enable single sign-on. When that happens, I get a bunch of claims returned back as part of the login experience. Based on that, I know who the user is. Then I can use this, create an authentication context using the tenant in which that user resides. And then I can call into the discovery client and say I want to get a token. Notice here it's saying acquire the token silently. I don't want any user prompts to pop up in this scenario, right? There is an authentication flow in which the user could then log in a second time. They log into your app. They could also log into Azure Active Directory. Preferably, we don't do that, right? So we choose the silent login. I'm going to, because I'm running out of time and I want to just hit the button here to show you. Oh, you know what? It's not going to, oh, great. What did I do? It worked a minute ago. Could not load at type. Are you kidding me? It's always something, isn't it? I just had this working. Let's try the one I just downloaded a minute ago. We'll just try this one. Let me build this. While it builds, I'll switch back to the slides. We'll get to the end. And what's left? If I double click the slideshow, F5. Oh, you're killing me. Where was I? OAuth flow, controller. There's nothing left. Thank you for attending. Good, excellent. So while we wait for this, all right. Demo failure, my apologies. What you would typically see is what we call the common consent dialog. Remember before when I did the SharePoint app, the SharePoint site administrator had the thing, do you trust it app? There is a similar page in Office 365 that's designed per user. And it would say, here's an app called O365 Web Single Tenant, wants to read your contacts. Do you consent that? Yes. If I use the Office 365 API and I ask for mail or contacts or sites or files, doesn't matter what I ask for, I always get the same dialogue. It's called common consent because it's a common consent, right? I see it all the time. So the end user then grants permission to their resources on behalf of the app, right? So instead of it's site collection based, it's the current user, right? Be aware that in SharePoint, if your app is trying to read a site and the current user doesn't have access to the site, they may click go ahead, but at the end of the day, it won't work because the end user doesn't have that permission to give you, right? So again, sorry for the failed demo. Any questions? Yes?
How would you authorize Azure service in single sign-on using JavaScript?
So the question, how would I use single sign-on with JavaScript?
Yeah.
So Azure Active Directory has published a library called ADAL, the Active Directory Authorization Library, so ADAL.js, that helps abstract some of that there. On-premise ADFS, you'd have to write that yourself. But you could probably take their, yeah, see ADFS doesn't support the OAuth protocol, at least it didn't last I checked. Yeah. ADFS is designed to authenticate Active Directory on-prem. There's no app principal in that on-prem AD, right? So it doesn't really apply. Doesn't work. However, if you're on-prem, can you use Kerberos? You know, that's the way to go. So that is your choice there. Any other questions? All right, thanks for coming. Hope you have a great day.